Welcome back to Change for Climate. This is the EPCOR stage and the Change for Climate, all the Change for Climate activities that the City of Edmonton is putting on in conjunction with the IPCC conference. Now that we have this slightly bigger crowd at Edmonton, I feel compelled to brag a little and remind you guys that this stage and these 3 days of activities in this room are all part of the whole IPCC event. This is not an IPCC event, this is a side stage, just like you would see at a COP event in Copenhagen or Paris or any one of those places. But this is the awesome place to be, right? Thank you. But what I wanted to remind you is just how cool this is. This is the first climate change science conference put on by the IPCC in the world. And it's right here in Edmonton, Alberta. So as you think about the conferences of the parties and the big climate change national conferences that have occurred, they didn't think it was as cool as it probably is now when it was in Berlin, I think it was, or Bonn, the first one 25 years ago. You're there. You're there at day one. So remember this 10 years from now when you look back at this. This is a seminal moment. So I just want you to notice that and just take a note. Remember you were here. Welcome to our noon hour presentation, While Nations Plan, Cities Act. I think that title was written by a guy from the city, I'm guessing, but I actually subscribe to that as well. I think cities are the place, they're closest to the people, they're the place where innovation happens more often, they're the place where you see creativity, and that we do some cool things. And so I think we're going to hear about some of those today in this noon hour session. So my first duty is to welcome Gary Bridgman, who's Senior Vice President with EPCOR, to the stage. This is the EPCOR stage. This event is sponsored by EPCOR. He's going to bring greetings, he's with EPCOR Water Canada, which provides drinking water and wastewater treatment services to more than 85 communities and industrial sites in Western Canada. This includes 1 million people in the Edmonton region. Since joining EPCOR in 1995, Guy has had several key leadership positions across the company, including Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer, Senior Vice President, Strategic Planning and Development, and Senior Vice President, Electricity Distribution and Transmission and Energy Services. Wow. I hope you're tired after all that. Guy holds a PhD in economics from the University of Western Ontario and is a graduate of the Harvard Business School of Advanced Management program. He's achieved ICDD-D designation from the Institute of Corporate Directors. Guy Bridgman, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone to the EPCOR stage. We're really grateful for the opportunity to gather here today on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Over these 3 days, Edmonton has welcomed the world and the inaugural Cities and Climate Change Science Conference. Scientists, policymakers, and urban thinkers from more than 80 countries have come together to share the latest research on climate change. While they engage in their work, the EPCOR stage is helping to bring the conversation about climate change to the community. It's been 3 great days of speakers and panels, open to the public and free to everyone. And there's still a half day to go, and we hope that you will all join us for the rest of the afternoon. In a few minutes, we'll hear from the 2 mayors who will talk about their vision and efforts in both Edmonton and Toronto to address a global concern. The City of Edmonton's taken an international leadership role as host of this important conference, but also a domestic leadership role with its green vision. EPCOR's a committed partner and supporter of the city's climate change initiatives. Citizens rely on us to deliver reliable electricity and to be a responsible steward of the water cycle through our water, wastewater, and drainage operations. As a provider of these essential services, EPCOR has the opportunity to lead through positive action. That's why we're investing in innovative flood mitigation projects to protect communities from extreme weather events, and why we're partnering with governments and community organizations to protect the North Saskatchewan River watershed, and why we're hardening our critical infrastructure, including investing in locally generated renewable electricity. In Regina, we recently upgraded and now operate the city's wastewater treatment plant to meet stringent environmental standards. And in Arizona, EPCOR people are experts in tackling issues of drought and water scarcity. We're leading the way in water reuse. These are just some of the actions that EPCOR is taking at the local level. Collectively, we believe they will make a difference. With more than half the world's population now living in cities, we believe municipal leaders have an unprecedented opportunity to lead climate change and make a difference. We hope that David Miller and Don Iveson will give you a sense of the scale of the opportunity that cities have today and inspire you to take action. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Guy Bridgman from EPCOR. Now on to the program. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have David Miller up to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion with the two mayors, so it's going to be great fun. David Miller is the former mayor of Toronto and a celebrated climate campaigner. Sorry, I lost my place there. Celebrated climate campaigner. Mr. Miller is now the North American Regional Director and Ambassador for Inclusive Climate Action at C40, an organization that is involving 90 megacities, 90 megacities around the world in working together, collaborating to work harder on climate change. C40 is focused on tackling climate change and driving urban action that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, climate risks, while increasing the health, well-being, and economic opportunities for urban citizens. Please join me in welcoming David Miller.
Thanks very much, David, for that gracious introduction, and Guy for your introduction as well, and EPCOR for its support of this really significant conference. I also want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Treaty 6 peoples. And I just want to say to the mayor and the city of Edmonton and our hosts how proud I am as a Canadian that the very first scientific conference of the IPCC about urban areas and cities was held in Canada right here in Edmonton. This was 10 years in the making, and we should be really, really proud. Second thing I should say is I do have some Edmonton connections. I feel I have to have the need to validate myself, because if I stood up here and said, I'm from Toronto, I'm here to help you, the reception might be a little brusque. My in-laws are actually from Thorsby. Does everybody know where Thorsby is? Yes. And oddly, when I was the mayor of Toronto, as you know, Thorsby in the 1950s was pretty small. Not only was my father-in-law from Thorsby, but my director of communications was from Thorsby as well. And my wife attended the wonderful University of Alberta. So it's a pleasure to be back in Edmonton, where that side of my family's from. So today I've got about 20 minutes, well actually 18 minutes and 30 seconds now, to talk a little bit about my perspective on the issue of climate change, which comes about from being a mayor, from being a city councillor, and also from having the privilege of chairing the C40 from 2008 to 2010. So I've been engaged on issues of climate for well over a decade from an urban perspective. And it's my perspective that cities are the ones who are acting and making change at scale, often while national governments talk. At this moment in Canada, we're lucky. Our national government is acting. Many of our provinces, including the province of Alberta, are showing significant leadership. But it's still in cities where we see real actions on the ground that are not only lowering our greenhouse gas emissions, but are making our cities economically stronger and more inclusive. And what I'm going to try to do today is talk a little bit about what we're seeing around the world, the kind of initiatives that are happening, the leadership shown by cities. Talk a little bit about Toronto, but I'll keep that as brief as humanly possible, and then wrap up. So, first of all, just to mention C40 Cities, as was said, we're now 90 plus cities, founded in 2005. C40 by design is about half cities from the developed world, half from the developing, and the population we represent are about 650 million people. It's an organization of mayors, though, and that matters because mayors have the ability to actually make actions happen. And it's also because it's the job of mayors and cities to make action happen. We run things. Cities aren't just about policy debates. They're about making better neighborhoods for people, running public transit, parks, all of those things that can also contribute to lowering greenhouse gas emissions and help addressing this incredibly urgent challenge. And there's another reason that mayors are interested in this. It's not just a philosophical thing, it's because it's necessary. All around the world, cities are seeing an increased frequency and severity of storms. I was on a radio station this morning in Calgary, and the interviewer asked me about why the science about cities was important. Why did it matter to have science at an urban level? And I said, well, one of the things that matters is, can we predict extreme weather events at a city scale to help cities plan for it? And he said, you mean like Calgary's floods? And I said, exactly. And I was speaking to Mayor Iveson. Edmonton is having to spend $2.5 billion to deal with drainage issues because of the increased severity and frequency of storms. So mayors are paying attention to this issue, not for some philosophical reason, but for a very practical reason. Cities are seeing the brunt of climate change. Toronto, between 2006 and 2010, in 4 years had 3 storms, each one of which is only supposed to happen every 50 years, hundreds of millions of dollars of damages to city assets, even more to private assets. So a really significant issue. The good news, the data of the C40 shows that most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, about 65 to 70%, can be attributed to cities and the activities required to sustain them. And by that I mean things like an electric plant. If it supports the city, it doesn't matter in that calculation if it's inside or outside city boundaries. So we know where the emissions are, and we also know that they're predominantly in 4 areas: how we heat and cool buildings, how we generate our electricity, our transportation, and our waste management. And if we can address emissions from those 4 areas, we can make a huge, huge difference. The challenge is it's really urgent. Our studies show that global emissions need to peak by 2020 if we're going to keep within the Paris target of holding warming to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels. So we've got to act now. And how do you do it? You have a plan, and then you address those areas: transportation, buildings, waste management, and electricity. The great thing about that is the clarity of thinking, because it allows good ideas to spread rapidly around the world. And that's one of the reasons our organization exists. It exists to have a strong voice for mayors with national governments to say, you need to support cities in their actions if you're going to achieve your own goals. But it also exists to share ideas, knowledges, and good practices with each other. Mayors don't mind competing with each other. They don't even mind if other mayors steal a great idea, as long as it works. So what do we need to do in order to achieve peaking and achieve the Paris goals from a city perspective? We need to decarbonize the electricity grid. In Alberta, you're phasing out of coal. Really, really important step. And I know EPCOR is starting to work on solar generation. City of Austin, Texas. You know, the heart of the oil industry in the world is Houston. City of Austin owns its own utility, and it's going to be, I think, 55% renewable energy by 2025, almost entirely through solar. A massive, massive change. So we're seeing examples. Sometimes cities don't control the electricity grid. Sometimes they don't control their own utility, so they have to do things like the City of Boston, which is setting up clean energy purchasing compacts with universities and other large actors in industry. But often they do have influence, like you do in Edmonton, and are able to support a transition to clean electricity. Second thing we need to do is improve our buildings. And if you think about a path to 2050, that's when the Paris Accords require dramatic drops in greenhouse gas emissions. Most of the buildings in the world that are going to exist in 2050 either exist now or are going to be built in the next few years. So what do we do about old buildings, and what do we do about new buildings to make sure that they're low carbon buildings. All sorts of things can be done. Energy retrofits, you can run systems more efficiently through better IT, you can build new buildings to really green standards. And we're seeing programs for this of various kinds all over the world, including involving the private sector. Melbourne, Australia, for example, has made huge strides, and I'll mention in some of the things Toronto has done, which are very interesting. And not all of this is about regulation. New York City is very innovative, and they've used a combination of knowledge and regulation. Under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, they required all commercial buildings over a certain size to post their energy consumption. That was all. The only thing I said, you got to be transparent. And what happened? There was a revolution in energy efficiency of buildings in New York City, Class A office space, because the tenants said, wait a minute, I don't want to pay for a really wasteful building. And they demanded that the landlords make changes. So we've seen Empire State Building, for example, make huge strides and dramatic reductions in energy use. And if you speak to the man who owns the Empire State Building, he doesn't talk about climate change. He talks about making money. He says, my building is way more profitable now, and he put something like $100 million in an energy retrofit, and he's making money off that. And that the catalyst for all of that was a simple requirement of transparency to show people how much energy was actually being wasted in these old buildings. Now, the one thing New York learned, though, the Class A office space, that worked. Smaller buildings, it didn't work as well. So Mayor de Blasio is bringing in a program to mandate better energy use. And the good thing about this, these kinds of programs pay for themselves over time. Maybe not as quickly as a private sector building owner wants. They like to have their capital paid back in 2 or 3 years. Might take 7. But if the building's going to be there 50 or 60 years, there's clearly an economic case for it. And we see these voluntary incentives and these mandates driving the change that's needed. And by the way, it's not really as sexy as things like transportation, solar panels, but buildings are where most of the emissions are. In Edmonton, I believe it's about 40%. In Toronto, it's about 60%. New York, it's 80%, the greenhouse gas emissions from New York City. So by making buildings better, and thereby making them more profitable for the owners, cheaper to run for public institutions, we can have a huge impact on greenhouse gas reductions, very significant. Transportation, building cities that are more dense, allow people to walk more, cycle more. Of course, there's electric vehicles, very important part of the solution. Public transport, very important part of the solution. Many C40 cities are moving to 100% electric buses. And this is cities in the global south as well as the global north. It's not just Los Angeles. We're seeing, in fact, in China, Mark Watts, who's the executive director of the C40, is over here, and I were in Hong Kong in 2010, and we saw a prototype electric bus from China. Now there are several Chinese cities that are entirely electric bus, happening at scale. And Edmonton's on the way. They've got some interesting programs on the electric bus as well. Very significant change that can be brought when cities collaborate in that way, and that's what the Fossil Fuel Streets Declaration was. A number of cities around the world declaring they're going to go all electric, and they're going to have a part of their city that is zero emissions as well. It doesn't have to be the whole city, but at least part. Final area, waste management. It's really around managing the methane. And the best way to do that is separate compost or separate food waste and have it be composted. Really significant reductions instead of allowing methane just to escape into the atmosphere. Very important in the developing cities of the world, especially. Now, for me, one thing that doesn't get mentioned often enough in these discussions, we get very technical. Yeah, how do we fix our buildings? How do we build better public transport? How do we build a city that is more dense so people can walk and cycle? But at the heart of all of this is people. And I firmly believe that unless we engage people and ensure that their needs are met, we're not going to succeed in having the political will that's necessary in order to achieve the ambitious goals of the Paris Accord, ambitious but necessary because this is urgent. And in particular, we see the impact of extreme weather events hurting the lowest income people globally and often lowest income people within developed cities like ours in Canada as well. So it's very important that as we're thinking about this, we think about ways to include those least well off. And I know that in your energy strategy in Edmonton, it was very inclusive, run by the University of Alberta on behalf of the city, bringing people to the table. And that's a model that other cities are going to learn from because it actually works. So a couple of statistics about this. When you build a climate-friendly city, turns out the people like it better because you're getting more parks, it's more walkable, you've got more public transit, it's easier to live. And so you see the world's most livable cities. I really apologize that Edmonton is not above Calgary. I was shocked when I saw this statistic. I don't know how it's possible. I considered amending the slide, but I thought that wouldn't be appropriate. It's obviously a biased survey, but it gives you a sense that people associate livability, like you do here with this beautiful river valley, with a good, strong, clean environment. We're also starting to see this isn't true in most parts of the world, but it is possible. So most parts of the world, you see economic growth and carbon pollution going up together. But Stockholm has showed that their city can be economically successful while driving emissions down. And that's the model we all need to seek. How do we ensure that we have shared prosperity while driving emissions down? And some of the areas I've spoken about lend themselves to exactly that kind of result. So I did want to give an example of how all of this comes together in one city, and the one I know best is Toronto, of course. So Toronto had a plan. 2007 is called Changes in the Air. It's our climate action plan. It had over 120 recommendations. And I'll get into the nature of those recommendations in a minute. The plan was just renewed by the city, Transform TO, that passed council last year and got significant funding in the city's budget this year. So the work has continued. And I should say that the original vote was unanimous. And I don't know if anybody follows Toronto City Council politics, but there's 44 councillors and one mayor. And we had occasions we couldn't even agree on what time to break for lunch. So having a unanimous climate plan meant to me that in a system of government that's very democratic, city councillors really listen to their constituents. It reflected that people in Toronto really wanted their city to act on climate. And that's why we had a unanimous vote. So what was done? We addressed buildings. We addressed public transport. We bought lower emission buses. This was before electric buses were available. We bought hybrids. We had the biggest increase in bus service in the history of Toronto twice. We started building light rail transit, a very significant 120-kilometer network. We helped the private sector do energy retrofits on their buildings. We did energy retrofits on our buildings, and we paid for it out of an internal city fund that paid itself back through the energy retrofits, so there was no impact on the tax base. And of course, if a government owns a building like a hockey rink, we're owning that for the long term. So as long as there's a payback that's reasonable, it doesn't matter to us if it's 2 or 3 years or 5 or 7. If it's a reasonable payback, we get the payback. And the nice thing about that program was, if we were doing an energy retrofit on a hockey rink, you could actually, at the same time, fix the rink. Your money sort of worked twice. We had green roofs. We have a bylaw that mandates very high-performance new buildings. One of my favorites, we have deep lake water cooling in Toronto. So instead of using air conditioning from what was then a coal-fired plant in the downtown core in the summer, they take cold lake water from Lake Ontario, run it through a heat exchanger, and take the heat out of the buildings. Very low-carbon solution and an interesting kind of Canadian technology. And Mayor Iveson always talks about this, but I see the opportunity for us to create some really interesting export-based industries if you do the right thing about climate. Why couldn't we take deep lake water cooling, the technology we developed in Canada through a publicly owned company, and export that technology around the world to cities that are next to cold bodies of water that are cold all year round? So that's some of the things we did. There's more. We engaged people and residents in their community, but as a result, by 2012, greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto had dropped by 15%, measured to a 1990 baseline. The reason we measured to a 1990 baseline is because that's Kyoto. That's when Kyoto started. And today it's something like 24%. So as a result of these actions and the closing of a coal-fired plant by the province, dramatic greenhouse gas reductions, and you always hear, oh, you can't do this, it's too hard on the economy. It's just not true. If anybody has followed the real estate market in Toronto, it's one of the 2 or 3 markets in the country that the federal government has had to take action on to try and cool it down. Toronto's extremely prosperous. Even after the 2008 recession, there were over 100 cranes in the sky building new buildings in Toronto. So you can have a city that is green, that is addressing its climate challenges, and is prosperous as well. And Toronto's certainly shown that through that work. Final point I wanted to make was the importance of public transport. This is the Transit City Plan that was passed City Council in 2007. There's been some political controversies, but it's still the heart of the city's plan. The Eglinton line's underway. The Shepherd line was underway and got stopped and will get started again. The Finch line was underway, got stopped, and will get started again. But I wanted to show this for 2 or 3 reasons. This is all light rail connected to the subway system. The first reason is that cities need a network. Toronto right now has basically got a couple of subway lines. It's fantastic. I live near a subway stop. It's great. But you need a network. Very, very important. It's important if you want to give people the opportunity to get out of their cars onto transit, build a network. Second is, because it's light rail, it's relatively affordable, certainly much more affordable than subways. A third is, there's an economic factor, because what Toronto was able to do when it builds these lines is welcome more development into the city rather than having sprawl-based development. And that has all sorts of environmental positives, and it brings jobs into the city, very important. The final thing is there's a social element. When we were consulting with the public about Transit City, I went out on the Shepherd East bus. And by the way, Toronto's 43 kilometers wide, okay? So from where I was to the airport would be about 40 kilometers. And I met a woman who said, Mayor, what are you doing on my bus? It's 6 in the morning. And I said, I've come to talk to you about light rail transit. And she said, what's that? And I said, it's sort of European style trams running in the center of the street out of mixed traffic. It'll come about every 5 or 6 minutes. You won't get caught up in traffic jams. You'll get where you're going faster, and they'll come on time. And she said, boy, could I ever use that? And I said, where are you going? To work. Where do you work? Pearson Airport. Okay, Pearson Airport's where the Transit City button is. We were at where the east on the Shepherd East is, about 40 kilometers. I said, it's a long commute, 2 hours. So you've got a long day. She said, that's my morning job. In the afternoon, she was a cleaner in the Royal York Hotel, which is downtown. So on a given day, she took bus, subway, bus, subway, bus. 4 hours or 5 hours on transit. 2 jobs. So what would this mean for her? It means she would get back a significant amount of time in her day. Maybe she could go to school. So she had the skills to have 1 job. Maybe she could have dinner with her family. Or maybe she could go out to the political meetings and say to the city councilors at night, you know what? I really want you to build transit in my neighborhood. I want to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions, and most of all, I want to be able to get to work without spending 4 hours. And that's the importance of transit, and that's also why thinking about climate change matters. Because you can address all the issues in your city about how we build a city that's economically successful, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. And that's why C40 Cities are working worldwide so hard on this issue. I appreciate your time and attention. I've gone slightly over. I apologize for that, but thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion with Mayor Iveson. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to welcome Mayor Don Iveson to the stage, Mayor of Edmonton. Don Iveson soared into political life 4 terms ago, and he hates it when I do this, but
I don't know about
he's okay. Well, he snuck in on the first one, But he beat an incumbent to become one of the youngest city councilors I think we've ever had. He's been elected 4 times already, twice to city council, twice as mayor. And I said this before, if you were here the other day, usually politicians get fewer votes over time because, you know, the more they say, the more there is to worry about them. Don's vote in the last election was among the highest ever for a mayor ever elected in this city. So I think we must be quite proud of him, I'm assuming from that. He's part of a council that unanimously passed something called the Energy Transition Plan, which we'll probably get into in a few minutes. And I'm going to start with a question with Mr. Iveson by asking him how we started this conversation about climate change and taking action on climate change in, you know, one of the oil capitals of Canada.
So good afternoon, everyone. And that was a great presentation, David. And one of the reasons why is that I was paying attention to what was happening in other cities. The Stern report came out in 2006 before I ran for council. And it was one of these things that I was like, why aren't we talking about this in Edmonton? Why aren't we talking about these issues in Alberta? They represent fundamental risk to our community. And at the same time, you know, if you're interested in urban issues, I was reading about things that were happening in Toronto, things that were happening in other cities around the world, and thinking Edmonton really should be part of this discussion. And so it's actually one of the reasons why I ran for city council and why Sarah and I decided to dedicate ourselves to public service, at least for now. So I brought that, and I wasn't alone. Other councillors who were elected at the time, Councillor Ben Henderson, who's done phenomenal work on this over the years, Councillor Amarjeet Sohi, who is now Minister of Infrastructure, is seized with these issues. And that's because about that time is when Assessment Report 4 came out, and that was before the scientists started using a lot of adjectives to tell us that as policymakers we really needed to pay attention to this issue. AR5, which came out in 2013, was when they started to get more vociferous with the public and with policymakers. But so how does this discussion land in Edmonton? Well, I mean, about the same time that I was thinking about running, there were still people in charge in Alberta who were talking about dinosaur flatulence being the cause of climate change. And there are still people writing in our newspapers, even yesterday, that it's solar activity. Well, if you go to page 667 of Working Group 1 report of AR5, I looked it up yesterday, it shows that yes, solar variability is a factor. And you net that out compared to the factor of anthropogenic greenhouse gas and land use impacts and albedo from all the other things that are changing. And yeah, solar is a factor, but it is not the big factor. So it just was driving me nuts as a citizen that we weren't thinking about the science and taking the scientists seriously. So translate that to political action. One of the ways that we were able to, two things happened actually that were significant. One is we held a conference related to this in 2009. Some of you will remember the ICLE Local Governments for Sustainability World Congress was held here in Edmonton. And that's where a lot of city networks came together, cities and sustainability networks came together, just as Edmonton was starting to ask some of these questions at City Hall. And the climate, science, and cities agenda really started at that conference, galvanized and became a plan of action that led 9 years later to this conference here. So we've actually been a staging ground for this, and some of the legacies that came out of that conference, because just like this, we had lots of public-facing components. We made it safer for people to start talking about these issues, and that gave room for politicians then to say more about these issues. But ultimately, I think one of the most transformational things that we did was embrace participatory democracy or deliberative democracy. Those are fancy political science terms for getting a citizen panel of people together through the Alberta Climate Dialogue Project and a partnership we did with the University of Alberta. We were able to actually get a representative group of Edmontonians in the room, show them some of the science, answer their questions, give them some options about these are some of the different things we could do, these are some of the risks of inaction, and these are some of the opportunities with action. What do you think? And they came to like 90+% agreement, including people who were suspicious about the science or thought that it was a communist plot, but could see an upside in reducing our exposure to flooding issues. in improving our air quality by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and reducing our exposure to commodity price fluctuations related to dependence on over-dependence on a single source for our energy. And so we were able to find multiple pathways with good democratic public engagement for a wide spectrum of Edmontonians with different points of view to agree that action was desirable. And then when we put that in front of Edmonton City Council, it was very easy for us to adopt our energy transition strategy. Now, we can talk a little bit more about what are the barriers to implementation, because we are not where we need to be yet on implementation of our energy transition strategy. But that's because cities control maybe 20% of the levers. Thankfully, we have a province that's greening the grid, that's bringing in incentives for energy efficiency retrofits that we believe is going to fund some transformational investments in public transit. And we have a federal government that has said the law of the land in this country is we will finally price pollution and not give it away for free, which changes the incentive structure. Yeah, that's worth an applause, absolutely. Pollution pricing changes the incentive structure, whether you're an oil sands company that now can fulfill a business case to reduce your greenhouse and water consumption, because there's now a payback, like David talked about on building retrofits. But it also has meant that even at $30 a ton, electric buses now make sense. They cost more up front, but they cost way less to run over time. So the business case is now there. And without pollution pricing, the business case isn't as strong. So all of these levers changing at all three orders of government now make it possible for us to implement that which our citizens, given the facts, given time to talk calmly amongst themselves with good facilitation, agree is the right thing to do, which is the same agreement that citizens in Toronto, citizens in Jakarta, citizens in London, and scientists, the very best scientists from around the world assembled at this conference, have all come to when they stop and talk to each other as human beings, as opposed to talk at each other with polarized perspectives. So, and local government is where we can do that depolarization, embrace that complexity, and that's what we've tried to do here.
David Miller, you worked on something called Transit City in Toronto. Talk about how the link between that and climate change and how that all works together.
You took the slide down.
Put it back on.
No, I'm kidding. I'm completely kidding. Well,
I still have my Transit City button. I was a big fan.
I'm very proud, Mayor. Thank you. Yeah. Well, one of the things we needed to do, and the mayor's right on this, is have a conversation with people. Municipal government at its best is very inclusive of people, and people help develop the policy. And Toronto's had a challenge for quite a long time. We've got a fantastic subway system, but it was built for a city of 1 million. Toronto's nearly 3 now, and it outgrew its transportation system. So what are the consequences of that? Well, if you live in the inner suburbs, you drive, unless you have no choice. Like the woman I was talking about had to take the bus. Most people drive. So driving creates all sorts of issues. Congestion in Toronto is really serious. It's more like LA than like, a city with a great functioning transit system like perhaps Berlin. And that creates lots of local air quality issues and carbon issues. Transportation system does other things. When you've got gridlock, you've got real costs for the private sector in goods transportation. We don't think and talk about that very much. So what we designed Transit City for was first a transportation imperative. Very important to build a transportation network for a city of 3 million, not a city of 1 million. And then the second thing was that enabled us to help shift people out of cars onto transit. The Toronto official plan at the time, which was actually passed before I was mayor under my predecessor, Mayor Lastman, was really radical. Mayor Lastman was very conservative, so it was surprising, but the plan actually said in it, Toronto should be built in a way that doesn't require people to own a car. And if you can build, it's not saying you have to not drive, but it means the city needs to facilitate that opportunity. And that's what Transit City did. And I guess one of our challenges, and I'm sure, Mayor, you find this too, the tax base for cities is about 7 cents on the dollar. Ottawa and the provincial government get the rest. And so to access the funding you need for an ambitious program like expanding LRTs, you need the support of the province and the feds. And there are moments in time when you have that, and then they seem to disappear. And that's a big challenge for Canadian cities. It's not because you don't have the right plan, it's not because people don't want it, it's not because it's doing all these great things for the city. It's very hard sometimes getting those governments aligned, and you seem to be doing that pretty well in Edmonton. I wish I'd had that gift, but...
Mayor Iveson, maybe you should take that as well, the question about transportation, because, we went to sleep. We built LRT in 1978 for the Commonwealth Games, a little line that goes out to my end of town, but I was the only guy in the city who had LRT because I lived in the Northeast. We went to sleep for 30 years after that. So how does this fit in as a climate solution, and how important is it, and what are the other components of it?
So maybe starting from the top down, where the federal government has committed now, which didn't exist when you were leading Toronto, to a national public transit strategy. And we were the last G7 country without a national transit strategy, if you can believe that. I mean, we were building railroads in the 19th century and highways and ports in the 20th century. And as we strive to build globally competitive cities for the 21st century, it took until 2 years ago for us to recognize that we need to get back into the train business as a country. And but those trains need to be in our cities to move the knowledge economy around and overcome congestion and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and support more walkable, healthy, more efficient to run cities. And so the federal government's recognized that with what amounts now to a $28 billion commitment over 11 years, which the big city mayors were able to secure through some solidarity and through, frankly, a federal government that gets cities. Having so many former city leaders like Minister Sohi, Adam Vaughan from Toronto, and others at the table in Ottawa has made a huge difference to the civic literacy of our national government. We're very close to an arrangement with our provincial government where one of the proceeds, and people say, well, where is this carbon money going when we pay it in Alberta? And it's going to go into building retrofits. It's already going into building retrofits, and it's going into renewable energy adoption, and those are all things that will help us achieve our collective goals. But one of the other things that we understand it will turn into is we don't know how big or how long it will be yet, but I think there's a case to be made for a substantial investment in rapid transit, not just in Edmonton and in Calgary, but in our region, out to our airport, out to St. Albert, and for transformative investments in public transit in Red Deer and in Grand Prairie, and bus electrification initiatives in those communities as well, so that Albertans in our cities, medium and large, can make different choices, and our cities can grow more responsibly. And so we're getting close, but even with the fits and spurts of money we've been able to get freed up over the last few years, we've been able to approve the Valley Line Phase 1. I'm confident we'll be able to get funding secured for Phase 2 to go all the way to the West End. But we're on a trajectory right now to build out our complete network over 30 years. And that means that most of a generation of city building is going to happen without the benefit of a complete network, which means a generation that looks more like business as usual with much higher rates of car dependency, consequent, even worse congestion, consequent affordability challenges, and consequent air quality issues. And so I'm really hoping that we'll be able to make the case persuasively, and Mayor Nenshi and I are grinding on this every day, for transformative accelerated investments in public transit. Because if we can actually tip towards more infill growth, more transit-oriented development growth, more density, more walkable communities with healthier people, there's actually not just a carbon payback and an infrastructure efficiency payback, but there's lots of evidence to show that communities with people who walk more and are out in their neighborhood more are safer communities, and that the people themselves are healthier. And if the most expensive thing the province of Alberta is dealing with is how to bend the cost curve for public health care, let's build cities that make people healthier because they walk more, and they're safer and more connected to their neighbors, and the air is cleaner, and people's overall lifestyle is more affordable because there may be a one-car household instead of required to have 2 or 3 cars in the driveway and 2 or 3 garage stalls everywhere they go to park them. So there is a more efficient city that is a lower carbon city, that is a healthier city, but the backbone of this always has been much better public transit than we have here today, back to the level of ambition this city had in the 70s and early 80s around transit.
Great. So for the final section, I'd like your thoughts, both of you, on what you think the impact of this conference is. David, you may have a different take on this than Don as the mayor of Edmonton, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are the impacts going to be? Like, you've been immersed in this, both of you, for a couple of days now.
Well, whatever Edmonton says is correct. That's out on the internet now. Oh boy, I'm in trouble when I get home. Just before I come out of that, just quickly, I was a bit unfair to the Paul Martin government, which funded transit quite significantly when I was in office. I should have mentioned that a bit. I think this conference has been really important. And one of the things that's come out of it, the mayor convened some global mayors here. And one of the things that's come out of it is we should be paying attention not just to the emissions that are generated from an urban area, but from the ones that are generated by our consumption. And it's quite relevant in a place like Edmonton. And that's something that's now in the thinking of the scientists and the urban organizations like C40 and IPCOR and others. And I would say that there's 2 or 3 things I've seen. The first is, this is urgent. The scientists almost take it for granted, but it has to be said, this is urgent. We need to act. The second is that there are a lot of cities doing the right thing, but we need more support from the scientific community, particularly around things like how do we forecast extreme weather events in a localized way. That's really significant. The third thing that's come through that actually surprised me, I thought I would be learning about better predicting of extreme weather, learning a bit more about the science of buildings, for example, and all of that's there. But the third thing that's come out really strongly is the importance of including people in these discussions, particularly the lowest income globally. And if we don't do that, none of the technical work is ever going to succeed. And I think if you think about that in a Canadian context, people have to see themselves as part of the solution. They have to know that their actions make a difference, but they also need to know that they and their family, their jobs are going to be protected, and there's going to be an opportunity for their children in the future. And there was a lot of discussion about how social science can support us in those kinds of conversations. And I think it's a really important conversation. The mayor and I know, because we get educated about this stuff, that there's going to be far more jobs in clean energy than dirty. In fact, there are now, today. But if you live in a town that's entirely dependent on coal, what are your kids going to do? And I think there's an obligation to say, you know what, in those towns, we're going to bring the clean jobs there. We're going to do something for you. And it's that kind of conversation that needs to happen, I think, to help ensure that the really good work that's ongoing in some cities and some provinces and many cities around the globe actually achieves what's needed to do at scale, which is answer this demand of urgency. We should have been acting for 25 years. Nations were talking instead of acting. We really need to act now. Oh, thanks. I didn't know that was going to be an applause line, or I would have delivered it a bit better. Nations have been talking for the last 25 years. Cities have been acting. We really need to act now.
That was great.
It never leaves you, Mayor.
Yeah, no. Well, that's the thing. Like, my style is a little more, let's talk about it, let's get to the evidence. But once in a while, you have to stomp your feet. And this is one of those issues where we got to stomp our feet a little bit, because the urgency is real, and the scientists keep reinforcing that with us every time we talk to them, that we can't, speculate for another 10 years. We gotta make definitive moves now. And we need to start looking upstream too. We've been talking a lot about bolt-on solutions to how we live today. But our consumption patterns, people talk about, all these emissions in China. Well, a whole bunch of the emissions in China have to do with the fact that there's 1 billion people there in a rapidly industrializing place. A lot of them have to do with the fact that China is producing a lot of this stuff for us. So this is a little ridiculous thing that I brought in for show and tell, because somebody well-meaning gave my kids 2 of these. There's candy in the bottom, there's a battery inside here, there's a motor inside here, and this is a fan so you can keep yourself cool as the earth warms. And yet, our consumption patterns, this is counted in China's footprint right now. But somebody thought to buy this, and it is now in my possession, and I don't know why. And we don't even think twice about this stuff. But a huge chunk of our footprint is stuff that we don't need, stuff that doesn't actually make us happy. I mean, this brought like 12 seconds of joy, and then my kids are like, whatever, Dad, right? So we got to think about consumption and consumption-based accounting, and thinking about the role of consumers in our own society in driving emissions in other parts of the world that are the workshops of the world. Now, here's another takeaway for me, is Canada is actually a really neat microcosm. This has become clear to me. We have sea level rise issues to deal with. We have desert issues to deal with. We have high Arctic issues to deal with. We have Indigenous communities who absolutely unjustly are experiencing conditions that are more like the global South, and who will be disproportionately impacted in not the same way, but in equally unjust ways that the global South will be impacted. And we have cities, and we have rural areas, and every different kind of biology just about that you can find on Earth, which makes Canada a really, really important lab, a democratic, inclusive lab to test solutions that are going to work for people, and that are going to create new jobs, and that are going to be economic to export and implement around the world. Because we can spend all our time being scared by the science, and the science is scary, or we can rise to the challenge, the greatest innovation challenge ever put before humanity. And when we think about the opportunities in renewable fuels, being a resource community means, and being a food growing area means, we have agricultural waste, we have forestry waste, and then because we have a lot of knowledge about chemistry and about industrial process control and advanced materials and petrochemicals, we have a company like SBI Bioenergy, which is turning those waste products into carbon positive biofuel. And they're so good at it that they have a partnership with Shell, which has reimagined itself from an oil company to being an energy company. And it's thinking about our assets here as not just being the non-renewable resources, but the intellectual power that we've built, and our capacity for invention, and our capital, and our people applied to these challenges. Then we can be part of the solution rather than being seen as part of the problem. I already see us that way, and I think one of the legacies of this conference is people will say, no, energy producers have something to say, and technology to bring to the table, and resources to bring to bear. And that's just around energy. We're a green buildings center of excellence. Landmark Homes is building net zero homes at par with the market, thanks to relentless innovation and commitment from Reza Nassery and his team. And EPCOR and Stantec and PCL, the three of them with Nate and the U of A, are forming a water center of excellence. And we know a large part of the adaptation challenge is going to be around water, and Edmonton can be part of that solution as well. So we're going to be really busy as Edmontonians and Albertans and Canadians rising to this challenge and doing our part. But I am more convinced than ever that we're going to play a pivotal role.
Fantastic.
I am more convinced than ever that we are going to play a pivotal role.
I think I'd like to wrap up by each of you posing a question to each other. And David, you're not allowed to do a lob on this one. You can ask him a hard question if you want. You guys have hung out together. The conference has brought, I'm sure it's prompted a lot of conversations. So let's start with David. Go ahead.
You're the capital of an oil-producing province. This is a tough conversation in Canada and Alberta. You got consensus, unanimous consensus around an energy strategy. To the outsider, that seems not very likely. So how did you manage to make that happen?
Commitment, knowing it had to be done. And for me, that's my kids. Because if we don't solve this, the world they're going to inherit is going to be a terrible place. So they keep me honest, even though they're tough conversations. My own family keeps me honest to that. But I think the other arguments that have been persuasive is it's when the question is framed is how can you make this transition without injuring the economy? Well, inaction is already injuring the economy. The 3 1 in 200 year floods that we've had here have disrupted families and businesses and already led to the first several $100 million worth of investment in right-sizing our drainage system that will be at least $2.5 billion worth of cost. It's debatable that the wildfires that we've seen and will continue to see are part of the cost of inaction. The flood events that we have seen and will continue to see are part of the cost of inaction. And go read the Stern report if you want to get really scared about the costs of inaction. So the economy is being injured today by our inability up to this point to systematically, planetarily grapple with this issue. And I think that that penny is starting to drop as these events hit close to home. But also, I mean, Alberta could not get the time of day in this country to get a pipeline built so that we could move our existing resources to other markets in a more carbon efficient way that is going to be safer in terms of not having trains that go past water bodies full of hydrocarbons, which is what's happening today. And oh, by the way, then we'll be able to get world market prices for those commodities. And as we go through an energy transition to a low carbon future, there's still carbon involved. And there will be markets, and there'll be different kinds of markets. There'll be need for plastic to make more crap like this forever. So people are going to need our stuff, and we need to move it in the safest and lowest carbon way possible. And pipelines are better than rail for that. And Alberta was able to get taken seriously by the federal government and most of the rest of the country on our pipeline ask precisely because we took leadership on carbon as a province. And the provincial government does not get enough credit for squaring that circle for Albertans. But this is not just good for Albertans who own the resource. Remember, this is our resource that is being discounted by the fact that we're landlocked. It also will improve the fiscal health of the province and improve the fiscal health of the country so that we have the money to invest in the public transit and the incentives for grid electrification and the building efficiency and all of the other things that we need to do on the public sector side. So doing the right thing for the environment has to be the right thing for the economy for the long term. And the denial of that over the years actually set us back as Albertans. So I'm really proud of where we are now. And I think not everybody's there yet, but I think there's a strong consensus around this. And so it's not that hard.
So Mayor Iveson, you get to ask a question of David Miller now. You're not allowed to use the words Rob Ford in the question, so.
Well, that's, here. There you go. You can cool down now. What is the most inspiring example? No, sorry, let me ask a different question. That's an easy one. What allies do mayors need in their communities and beyond to be most effective in this area?
That's a great question, one that I didn't anticipate. And I was going to say you should have the last word, so maybe I should let you answer the question. All
these fine people here.
I thought you really eloquently spoke about Alberta's challenge in the last few minutes. The first ally is people. And it's, I find when I give talks like this, people afterwards say to me, really found that interesting. It's inspiring to know that real action is happening, but what can I do? And I think if the examples in cities where that interest of people has been channeled into things that people can do and also support for public action through their city government, that's incredibly powerful because it's unstoppable. And also when governments change, people keep doing it. I mean, you did mention my successor, and I must say, I ride public transit everywhere in Toronto, and for 4 years I had people saying, why didn't you run again? You can get tired of that after a while. But the climate plan didn't change. And for those of you who know, Mr. Ford was a little bit different than me. The climate plan didn't change. It kept going. Why? Because the people of Toronto were on side. And you see this around the world where the great things are happening. people are really engaged. In Oslo, in Norway, they have a city budget and a carbon budget. And we're not quite there yet in Canada to do that. But the way it works is, if the city budget, the numbers are doing something, it doesn't work for the carbon budget, finance has to go back and figure out the finance budget, the carbon budget rules. Now that's probably the most advanced city in the world, but that wouldn't happen without the people of Oslo supporting it. And I think that's the biggest strength. The challenge globally is, how do we include people whose voices aren't heard? You know, how do we include Indigenous people living in communities built on permafrost where the permafrost is melting? How do we include Inuit people in the Arctic? When I was working at the World Wildlife Fund, we had Inuit people tell us they were seeing animals and birds that there was no word for in their language because they'd never been there because of the sea ice melting. Yeah, how do we include low-income people in a city in this conversation and ensure their needs are met? I think that's the big challenge. It's the flip side of the biggest asset, but for absolute sure, where there's inspiring work, there's an engaged citizenry, they're engaged with their city government, and for me, that's the gift of the city government, because that's what city governments are good at, pulling the people together and achieving a common vision. And you know, my sense, Mayor, in Edmonton, that's exactly what you've done. It's why this hall has been packed for 3 days, and it's why Edmonton's going to succeed. It's terrific. So thank you.
And perhaps you're right, David, we should give the last word to Mayor Iveson. Mayor Iveson, this conference, I sense something happening here, you know, with all of the conversations, all of the events. Will this help Edmonton act faster, be bolder, take more chances, and stare this beast down?
Absolutely. The same way it accelerated our own thinking and our own confidence to have the Cities and Sustainability Conference that we did in 2009. This will, I believe, have the same impact. Thanks to so many of you coming out, the folks tuned in on the live stream, the youth who've been doing some extraordinary work at NAIT and at U of A, MacEwan, and at Queenie High School. I attended a roundtable session with students from most of Edmonton's high schools, as well as students from 12 other countries who had come in both virtually and a small number in person to write a paper for this conference that'll be tabled this afternoon on the youth perspectives on these issues. And I think when we listen to those perspectives, which are crystal clear and morally unambiguous and urgent in their aspiration, then as long as policymakers, if we can stay listening to that rather than the convenient excuses to slow down, and you have to be cautious. We have to make good and intentional public policy decisions and look for best practices from other cities in these global networks that have been here. We can't act rash, but we can't make excuses anymore either. And I think this conference is going to help hold us honest to that into the future.
So could you stand up and stomp your feet when you say that, just so we can end on a good note? Mayor Don Iveson and David Miller from C40 and the former mayor of Toronto, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David, and thanks to you.